The national stereotype of British people is that we're miserable and spend half our lives complaining about the tiniest of things. Being British, I feel a natural urge to kick back against that stereotype. Then I remember with me, it's entirely 100% true. Come on Stuart, it's a nice day. Yes, but tomorrow it might not be a nice day, and then I'll have work the day after that so I won't get to enjoy it, and then maybe there'll be another nice day in a few months' time, and then there won't be again, and the whole vicious cycle will continue until both of us are dead. This attitude problem is also reflected in my family, our country's version of the American-style family sitcom, typically the happiest, lightest, fluffiest genre of TV, and yet Britain's version of this genre is... well...
When I was younger, I used to think that people died because life was unfair. And then when I saw you and your brother and sister born, I realised life was unfair. And expensive.
We're quite alike, me and you. Yeah. You know why?
Because we both live in cages. Except you can't see the bars in mine.
Some British people are probably going to be scratching their heads when I say that my family was the British version of the American-style family sitcom, but that is in fact where the show came from. It was created by American TV comedy writer Fred Barron. He says it was inspired by his dad, who was very grumpy and cynical, and a show about this type of character just didn't gel with the American networks he pitched it to. They wanted to water it down and turn it into something with a lighter moral focus, and what I believe the Americans refer to as schmaltz. The BBC, however, were open to a sitcom with a much more cynical tone because that's just what we're like in Britain. And it clearly worked. My Family is one of the longest running British sitcoms ever made, and one of few to have over 100 episodes to its name. You may have problems with me referring to it as British given its American roots, but it is in fact one of the biggest success stories in the history of TV sitcoms made in this country. But My Family never gets treated like that. You still hear people talking about Only Fools and Horses, The Vicar of Dibley, Fawlty Towers, but I never really hear My Family repeated in the same breath as those shows, when it was in actual fact a very big deal in Britain back in the 2000s. Most British people watching this video who are around my age will almost certainly have seen at least a handful of episodes of My Family. Maybe its premise wasn't quite as remarkable and maybe it wasn't all that culturally influential, and speaking to people like me who are also nostalgic for My Family, we all seem to have forgotten just how completely and totally miserable it is.
Well, is there anything else?
There just has to be. Somewhere.
My Family is about the daily lives of parents Ben and Susan Harper and their 3 children, from oldest to youngest, Nick, Janie and Michael. Ben's a dentist, Susan's a tour guide. Nick's the stupid one, Janie's the shallow one, Michael's the smart, dorky one, and they all play off the miserable father and controlling mother in different ways. They deal with all the old standards. Michael is being bullied at school, Janie wants to have a party while Ben and Susan are away, Ben has a feud with a neighbour. You probably recognise these plots from a billion different family sitcoms you've watched over the years. It is openly a throwback, and that's probably part of why the show was popular with audiences, but less so with critics, and that's probably why its cultural impact is nowhere near as massive as any of the UK's other big sitcoms. The one thing that My Family's got going for it though is it takes all of those old sitcom standards and applies a grim and gritty spin on basically everything that happens. Susan's horrible new boss comes to stay with them, that's awkward and embarrassing. It could have just led to a normal escalation of drama, but no, instead he dies in the middle of the night, and the rest of the episode is about Ben and Susan having to deal with the fact that someone died in their bedroom. And stuff like this happens in basically every reiteration of those same old scenarios. Watching My Family back now, I find it strange that British children were allowed to watch it. The DVDs are mostly rated PG to 12, I think I was about 12 when I first started watching it, and this surprises me. There was this big moral panic in the UK around the mid-2000s over Little Britain, because it was full of shock humour and British kids were staying up late to watch it. And while My Family may not be anywhere near as explicit as Little Britain, its depressing outlook on the world makes me wonder why similar conversations didn't happen with My Family. Is the negative worldview it offers just so normalised in Britain that no one noticed just how bleak it is? Everybody cared about shows like Little Britain and South Park supposedly warping young minds with toilet humour. They didn't care so much about My Family reinforcing a consistently negative worldview because it just seems to be normal in Britain.
Hello, dear. How was your day? Boring, hopeless, or just plain crap?
Sad thing is, these are the best years of your life.
The first episode ends with Ben and Susan having to reassure Michael, who's heard them arguing and is worried about the prospect of them getting a divorce because the parents of one of his friends from school recently got divorced, and they manage to reassure him, but it doesn't exactly sound like their marriage has a strong basis.
Despite all this, your mother knows that she'll never find a bigger sucker as me.
And your father knows he'll never find anyone else who'll have him.
There's this episode from season 1 where Ben sort of accidentally sets Janie up with the son of a rich patient at the surgery. The son then tries to assault Janie, and when a character who Ben thinks is the son shows up at his dental practice, Ben tries to perform surgery on him without giving him anaesthetic.
Right, it's showtime.
No, you haven't given me my Novocaine.
Ah, good.
What I just read could easily be the plot of a horror revenge movie. Instead, it's an episode of a light and fluffy British sitcom. It's a funny episode, don't get me wrong, but I'd just be incredibly interested to see how an American who's grown up with American family sitcoms would react to something as aggressive as My Family. It's honestly no wonder it didn't work when Barron pitched it in the States. On reflection, some of the dynamics between the characters can feel a bit cartoonish now, because no one ever seems to be that interested in the question of why people behave the way they do. They just assume the worst of them. The entire dynamic between Ben and his eldest son Nick is that Nick has all these stupid ideas for careers that are obviously not going to work out, and whenever he gets a job he acts out and gets sacked. And Ben just wants Nick to get a steady job, stick with it and move out already. Ben assumes that Nick is just lazy and an idiot and that's why he never gets a job and sticks with it. But watching this back now, I stopped and thought, wait, Ben? Why has Nick turned out like that? Who raised him here? There's this episode where Nick gets a job at a supermarket, so you'd think that Ben would be happy, but his first instinct is to make fun of him for it, because of the cultural stereotype that a job in retail means that you're of lesser value to society.
I'm working as a shelf stacker. Qualco Foods in the high street.
You might be stacking shelves today, but who knows, if you work hard and stick at it, tomorrow you may be, stockroom manager.
Yes!
And yet when Nick goes for a more socially respectable job at a bank a few episodes later, the joke now is that Nick is clearly not qualified for it.
It's for a senior accounts manager at a bank.
That's wonderful, Nick. It's not our bank, is it?
It's almost as if Ben and Susan have developed this view of Nick that he can never do anything right, and that reinforcing this fatalistic attitude towards him is actively reinforcing his bad behaviour whenever he actually gets a job and gets sacked or drops another interest week in, week out. Their failings as parents do occur to them both on rare occasions, like this episode where Nick starts seeing a much older woman and they try and rationalise it.
Think what she can teach him, how to dress, how to behave, how to hold down a job.
Weren't we supposed to do that?
Yes.
It's interesting seeing an American-style family sitcom retooled for a British context, because the show does know that American sitcom tropes just don't work in this country. British people are much more repressed. We don't do big displays of emotion, to the point where we find it hard to even tell our loved ones that we love them. So My Family has to really push hard to confront Ben about his relationship with Nick in a way that makes sense for a British father. There's an entire episode about how Ben just can't tell Nick that he loves him because he feels too embarrassed, which just wouldn't work in an American sitcom.
Have you ever told Nick that you love him?
Are you completely insane?
So the show does know that Ben is emotionally stunted, and it does rightly punish him for it, but you do come away from most of these scenarios thinking that Ben is in the right to treat Nick the way he does, because Nick isn't exactly a complex character. Almost every line from him is something like, "Hey Dad, I have this stupid new idea for a career that's obviously not going to work out because that is the source of the comedy."
No, I'm going to become a .com millionaire.
Really? That's great. So shouldn't you get a good idea first?
But it is a good idea. .com millionaire. All that money.
All that being said, the Ben-Nick relationship is basically the entire reason to watch the show, and I had a great time watching some of these back again. Robert Lindsay and Chris Marshall are essentially an in-show double act, working on the formula of one is the chirpy dimwit who says things that are funny in and of themselves, but also provoke entertaining reactions out of the grumpy miserable one. They play off each other incredibly well, although I can see why Chris Marshall felt the need to leave the show after its first few years, because this is a role that an actor can get easily trapped in. To this day, whenever I see Chris Marshall show up in anything else, I imagine him with that empty-headed grin on his face going, "Hello Dad, can I borrow 20 quid?"
Relax, Mr. Harper. You're in good hands. Now here's your surgeon.
Hello, Dad.
Despite this, Chris Marshall has had a fair career outside of My Family, in shows like Death in Paradise and Doctor Who, where he played the Doctor. There's actually quite a lot of Doctor Who alumni who show up in My Family. There's Peter Capaldi, Joe Martin. Of course, Zoe Wanamaker herself was Lady Cassandra in Doctor Who. Here's future Master Michelle Gomez in a role that's going to blow your mind if that's the main thing you know her for.
You've got a clown painted on your ceiling.
Yes, that's Bobo.
Bobo's got a bulbous red nose and nice white teeth. I think Bobo likes you.
Like Nick, Janie starts edging out of the house when she goes off to university in season 3, and bizarrely she's even absent for an episode about the birth of her child Kenzo in season 4. It's actually quite avant-garde to have an episode of a sitcom about the birth of a character's child in which that character is absent. And how do they do this? By having Susan on the phone to Janie all episode, hearing about this big life-changing event that's happening off-screen.
Don't worry, Jenny. You've got me as your birth partner. I'll start on the phone, but when we arrive, I'll be able to roll up my sleeves and... Oh, Janie!
And you know what this reminded me of? Twin Peaks: The Return. Michael Onkeen wouldn't return to reprise his role as Sheriff Harry Truman, so his character ends up being silent and on the other end of the phone whenever he gets brought up. Yes, I did just reference a David Lynch project in a video about My Family. No, you're not dreaming. As it becomes obvious the kids are either going to grow up or leave, more characters are mixed in as others spend time away like Janie or leave completely like Nick. The show ends up being this subversion of the whole mantra that family is forever and nothing can break apart a family, when the only constants throughout the show are Ben, Susan and Michael. It's incredibly strange that My Family lasted as long as it did when the original cast only did 2 complete seasons of the show together. A lot more of the show gets dedicated to the romance between Ben's co-worker Roger, a naive, dim-witted dentist who works in the same building, and Abby, a nice but dim-witted cousin who gets invited to stay in season 3. Her running joke is that she's accident-prone. Her first appearance involves her putting her fist through a window and bleeding everywhere. So life in the Harper house is always chaotic for the purpose of making sure that Ben never gets what he wants. Ben spends most of the show's lifetime longing for this idealised future for himself where the kids have moved out, he's retired, and he has all this free time and peace and quiet where he can put his feet up and relax. But watching it back, I started to think that a small part of Ben needs chaos in his life. Not just because, you know, he's a sitcom character, and if there weren't any chaotic things happening, then the show would end. I mentioned the prospect of divorce earlier, and the threat of divorce does get used quite a lot as jokes. But I did start wondering, why does Ben not want a divorce from Susan? Susan drives Ben crazy. Susan's the one who invites Abby to live with them, and she's always stirring up drama between him and the kids. But given the sheer contempt that Ben displays for everything Susan does, you end up thinking, why doesn't he just leave? Ben earns a decent wage. He could just get up and leave, but he doesn't because complaining is what gives his life meaning. There's this episode in season 3 called The Lost Weekend, where Ben finally gets his wish. Janie's away at university, and Nick, Abby and Michael are all away for the weekend for various reasons. And he and Susan have the house to themselves and all this free time. And they spend basically the entire episode bickering over what they should spend their time doing. And over the course of one day, they get to the point where they realise they have nothing in common.
Well, nothing wrong with having nothing in common, otherwise there'd be no point in having 2 of us.
What is the point in having 2 of us?
It's almost as if the kids were this necessary evil there to hold the marriage together, and with them gone, it's completely obvious that Ben and Susan are total opposites. They've been put together by sitcom writers because it's funny to watch conflicting personalities rubbing up against each other to create funny situations. It's not a very fun episode, but The Lost Weekend to me is one of the most honest episodes of a sitcom I've ever watched. It demonstrates the paradox that British people live with. We spend our lives complaining about everything, our jobs, our families, and we long for this one fabled day where everyone finally stops bothering us and has left us alone so we can finally be at peace. But there is actually a purpose to chaos. The kids gave Ben and Susan this shared goal, to tackle the problems the kids created together, and with them gone, they're so thoroughly irritated and bored by everything the other says and does, and even if they did split up and Ben got to lie on the sofa and do nothing for the rest of his life while Susan went antique shopping, they would still do their respective activities, run out of enthusiasm for them, and then end up feeling directionless and empty. Chaos isn't just there to extend the life of a sitcom, it's there to give people's lives meaning. Similarly, out here in the real world, I myself like to imagine this mythical day where I can give up work, maybe retire from YouTube, put my feet up, and never have to bother doing anything again. Except I won't be able to, because there will always be that itch on the inside of my brain going, you gotta do something. Cause some trouble. Say something controversial on the internet and see what happens. Yeah, but it'll make me miserable, won't it? Yeah, but it'll be interesting, won't it? Admit it, that book you're reading shit and you're bored out of your fucking mind. Go on, you've been meaning to make a video about South Park for years, that'll piss people off. Go on, Stuart, do it. True happiness is impossible for British people, because misery is what gives our existences meaning. My family's exaggerated grim perspective on the simplest of problems, like an argument with your boss or a train that's stuck in a tunnel for a long time, may seem overly petty, but it is what British people are like. Maybe that's why my family never gets mentioned in the same breath as all those comedy greats that everyone talks about with such reverence, and why it was always a punch bag for critics. Sure, part of that was because the quality of the writing clearly started to suffer in the second half of the show's lifetime as characters kept leaving, and the show had to shift around and adapt to changing circumstances on a near constant basis, but I think there's another reason behind my family's mixed legacy. It's because it held up a mirror. Sure, it was conceived by an American, and you might have a natural instinct to accuse it of offering up a caricature of what British people are like, but ask yourself this one question. Is it really not true? Really?
Is that evidence for the insurance company?
No, this is for the travel company in case we have to complain.
Admit it, my family reflected our national character with complete accuracy, and people just didn't like what they saw.